Nathan Latoile of American Farmland Trust. We're bringing you this webinar today thanks to the support and interest of USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. This webinar would not be possible without a strong partnership between NRCS and AFT and the great work of the staff here at both organizations. From AFT, I'd like to give a special thank you to Emran Irby and Jamie Potter, who've done much of the advance work to set this up. For the last 40 years, AFT has worked to conserve agricultural lands. For the last several decades, we've invested heavily in federal policy and have made funding for farmland protection a major focus of that work. And we've been successful. Not only does money flow to New England for farmland protection, but to be frank, in recent years, the availability of federal dollars has exceeded our ability to use them. The pot of federal funding for farmland protection is large, and the allocations given to each state are not always transparent and are not easily understood. But one thing is clear: when the demonstrated demand is high and the closing rate for projects is fast, more money is available. As demand declines or closing periods extend, the availability of funds decreases. In a recent analysis, AFT found that most New England states are not taking full advantage of the federal funds available for farmland protection. And we're taking several steps to work on this. And one such step is to increase the awareness of the nation's largest single source of farmland protection funds and to increase demand in the program over time. Here in Massachusetts, utilizations of these funds have traditionally been left to the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture and its APR program. Due to limited staff capacity and the demands of stewarding existing easements for the nation's oldest state-run farmland protection program, there's an opportunity for more direct interest and participation in NRCS's farmland protection program by local and regional organizations. So thank you for taking the time to join us this morning as we look to build that demand. I know this webinar is going to provide a lot of information, but I suspect it may raise as many questions as your mind as it answers. After all, every land protection project is unique, and they always seem to generate learning opportunities. We won't have a chance to dive into project-specific questions today, but after today, you'll know what the opportunity is, you'll know enough to ask some great questions, and you'll know where to go with those questions. Before I hand this off to NRCS, I want to make a plug for two great further information sources that you'll hear a little more about at the close of the presentation. AFT's National Agricultural Lands Network, a free professional networking and support system comprised of over 400 entities and individuals directly engaged in farmland protection, and the Farmland Information Center, which I think is best described as a reference library for farmland protection, complete with live individuals just a phone call or an email away who can answer all of your farmland protection questions. Links to each of those resources are in the chat. And I mentioned earlier that this would not be possible without NRCS. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dan Wright, who leads NRCS's incredibly talented team here in Massachusetts. To you, Dan.
Basis that I was really hoping to, get the point across and emphasize again that NRCS brings a large amount of funds available for land conservation in our various easement programs under the ACEP umbrella, our Agricultural Conservation Easement Programs umbrella, both for farmland protection and wetland conservation. We have a lot of opportunities to do more within Massachusetts and throughout New England, and we hope to get that word out. While we value our partnership with the State Department of Agricultural Resources, we are looking for opportunities for land trusts and conservation commissions and others with an interest in land conservation to do more. And today's webinar is intended to increase that awareness and that ability for land trusts to tap into our available resources. Additionally, land conservation is something I have a personal interest in, having worked on easement programs in several states myself, and have invested in increasing our ability to reach more valuable lands within Massachusetts, putting funds into agreements to increase our locally important farm soils and land eligibility classes. We're really trying to increase our ability to work with land trusts to conserve lands and benefit the region as a whole. So looking forward to the conversation today, looking forward to hearing from partners in the future, and really looking forward to increasing land conservation through us in the region. So thank you for the introduction, Nathan. Thank you, AFT, for Jamie and Emron. Thank you so much for your contributions and keeping us all on task. Very much appreciated, and we wouldn't be sitting here today having the conversation if you hadn't been on point with that. So thanks to all, as well as my staff, Rita, stepping up to present, and Alan Decker from BBC here to give us a perspective from one of our valued partners in the state. So many folks come together to make this all work, and I appreciate the efforts of everyone. So thank you very much, and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Dan. I think we go right to Rita now, right? Yep, you're on mute, Rita.
Thank you, everyone. What I've done today is put together a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to go through, as was suggested. If we can hold, questions till the end, I'll give my presentation, and then Alan's going to give a perspective from the Land Trust in working with NRCS ALE. So just to start off, this is going to be a very broad overview of the ALE program. So just to start off, ACEP stands for the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. And within the ACEP program, we have two specific sub-programs under that. The first one is the ALE program, which is the Agricultural Land Easement Program. And that program is specifically geared toward agricultural lands. We think about, prime farmland soils as such. ALE is a consolidation of the old farmland and ranch land protection program and the grassland protection program. So those two programs from prior farm bills were combined into this newer version, which is now ALE. NRCS provides match funds to entities for the purchase of agricultural land easements. And these easements are held by the eligible entity, but the United States government holds a third-party right of enforcement on those. On the other side of ACEP is our Wetland Reserve Easement Program, and that carries on the same functions as the old Wetland Reserve Program, just a change in the name, a little bit of change in some of the policy, but it's basically the same. NRCS purchases easements directly from private and tribal landowners through a reserved interest deed in eligible land to restore, protect, and enhance wetlands and associated land, which could be like a riparian buffer, something like that. Next slide. So this is just basics of what we're going to go over today. When you're talking about ACEP programs, it's a very intense program because you're talking about easements, you're talking about land acquisition, and it's a little time consuming. It takes some time to get through the process from start to finish, from submitting an application until you're finally through the acquisition. So we're just going to kind of hit the highlights of this program today. It's a short amount of time to get through it. So what we're going to talk about is entity eligibility, land eligibility, landowner eligibility, ALE agreements, closing ALE easements, and stewardship. So an overview of what ACEP ALE, what the purpose and the objectives are, it's really the protection component. It's to protect, restore, and enhance programs, land, whether it be wetlands or prime farmland on eligible lands. It's there to protect the agricultural viability and related conservation values of eligible land by limiting non-agricultural uses on that land that negatively impacts the agricultural uses and the conservation values, and protects grazing uses and related conservation values by restoring or conserving eligible land. That comes right out of policy. That right there is the basic purpose and objectives that you'll see written in policy under the Farm Bill. NRCS provides cost share assistance to eligible entities to purchase agricultural land easements from eligible landowners to protect the agricultural use, including grazing uses and related conservation values on eligible land. NRCS's role is to ensure that the landowner, the eligible entity, and the property are all eligible, and that our eligible entities are meeting program objectives and requirements. So that's part of the process. NRCS is required by statute to ensure that ALE-funded agricultural land easement deeds contain provisions that ensure that the program purposes are met. So as part of that, purchasing of easements, we need to ensure that these purposes and objectives of the program are met. So we'll start by eligible entity categories. So there's 3 basic entity categories that an entity could fall under. And those 3 are a state or local government. And as you know, both Dan and Nate mentioned in their opening remarks, NRCS does a lot of work with ALE, with Massachusetts Department of Ag Resources. So they fall into that state or local government category. Another option is for an eligible entity to be an Indian tribe. And then the third is a non-governmental organization. So for example, a land trust, something we have more of a tendency to partner with maybe out here in the Northeast. In other areas of the country, there are farmland protection boards and things like that. So for example, here in the Northeast, it'd be probably the land trust. For Indian tribes to be recognized to fall in that category, you'd have to be recognized as an Indian tribe as defined by Section 4E of the Indian Self-Determination Educational Assistance Act. So there is additional information there. If we had an entity that fell into that category and chose to apply through that means, we can provide more information about that. So entity eligibility requirements. To participate in the ACEP ALE, entities must provide sufficient documentation for the state conservationist to make a determination that the entity is eligible. So that could be different things. Documentation, so authority and capacity to acquire, manage, and enforce agricultural land easements or their equivalent, have an established farmland protection program, demonstrate a commitment to the long-term conservation of agricultural lands. So in order to show proof of their eligibility, the entity must provide copies of their incorporation documents or bylaws that indicate that they're eligible, that they're an eligible entity. ALE needs to include conservation easements for the purposes of protecting either the agricultural use and future viability and related conservation values of eligible land by limiting non-ag uses of that land, and grazing uses and related conservation values by restoring or conserving eligible land. That's also considered grassland projects. Those types of projects are geared a little more toward the Midwest, toward rangeland. We really don't have that category here that I know of, that we've ever had a project that fell under grasslands, but it's always something that we can investigate if by chance someone did have a project that might fall under that. Also, for entity eligibility requirements, an entity needs to have staff capacity dedicated to monitoring and easement stewardship, because that is part of the process and the agreement. Once, a project has come all the way through from start to finish, and now there is an easement on that property, there's a stewardship part, and the entity needs to be able to do the monitoring and that stewardship part of the process. That is not something that falls back onto NRCS. And entities also need to have the ability of funds at the time of the application sufficient to meet the eligible entity's contribution requirements for each parcel proposed for funding. So, as I mentioned on the earlier slides, there's a match, and NRCS provides 50% of that fair market value from an appraisal. And so NRCS would provide the 50%, and then the match would be the responsibility of the eligible entity. Whoops, let's see. Also,
Rita, sorry to interrupt. I think we're a little behind on the slides. Can you get us on track here?
I'm on 9.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, entity eligibility. Entities with existing ACEP ALE or Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program, so the old FRPP agreements, or easements that are delinquent or deficient in satisfying the terms of those agreements or easements, may be determined ineligible for funding under ACEP ALE until such time as deficiencies are addressed. So, sometimes things happen and folks fall behind on whether it's, their stewardship, their monitoring. Things happen. It doesn't mean that you can't come back and get back into compliance. So if by chance that were to happen, you may not be eligible at the time that you wanted to submit a new application, but perhaps, with a little bit of work, you could come back to being an eligible entity again. So failing to conduct monitoring or provide annual monitoring reports to NRCS, or if they're insufficient or they're late, those are situations where you could be considered ineligible for that time frame. Existing FRPP or ACEP ALE agreements with funds remaining more than 2 years after the attachment execution date, without any expenditure or actions towards closing of easements in the 3rd year, can also deem you ineligible at that time. Next slide. So here are some of the responsibilities of the entity as part of the process. So the entity is responsible for legal and administrative services. They have to pay for procurement costs. They hold the title. They meet ALE requirements, and those requirements are always, found in deed terms and such. They complete an ALE plan. Now, if there's an instance where you may have some highly erodible land, or there's perhaps something to do with an existing highly erodible land, which we would consider HEL. Okay, so maybe you've got a little bit of a slope on a piece of the property. NRCS is responsible for the development of the HEL plan to ensure that the producer is in compliance with HEL provisions of the Food Security Act. But an ALE plan, which we would consider a conservation plan on the property, is really, it's what NRCS does, but we no longer have that responsibility or are required to do it. It is up to the eligible entity that would be applying to get through the process. It would be their responsibility if they chose to have a conservation plan on that property. This was a change in the 2018 Farm Bill. So only HEL plans still falls under the responsibility of NRCS, but a regular conservation plan, like a farm plan, that looks at the land uses, it looks at the goals of the producer. That is the responsibility of the entity if they so choose. Other responsibilities of the entity would be to meet performance deadlines, maintain SANS and DUNS registration, complete the monitoring, and enforce the terms of the deed and the plan if something were to go wrong. Something was noticed during, for example, if something was noticed during a monitoring, they are responsible for ensuring that those corrections are made. Next slide. So this next slide starts to talk about land eligibility. And land eligibility is also, that's your, that's what helps to determine whether a piece of property would be eligible for ACEP ALE. So an on-site review by NRCS is required prior to NRCS making a land eligibility determination. So to be eligible for ACEP ALE, land must be private or tribal land, that is agricultural land, subject to a written pending offer, eligible for one or more of the enrollment option categories, which I will mention, land which is in, land in an area which has access to agricultural markets, and agricultural land that faces development pressure. Those, those are some of the things that should be considered. So this includes land on, farm and ranches for purchases of an agricultural land easement. The categories are, it should have prime, unique, or other productive soils. It could have historic or archaeological resources. Enrolling the land would protect grazing uses and related conservation values. And protecting the land will further a state or local policy consistent with the purposes of ACEP. And that is something that we've had a lot of questions about lately from some of the land trusts and actually from MDAR as well. So that is something that Massachusetts NRCS is working with American Farmland Trust on to look at those opportunities. Land that is at least one of the following. So it needs to be either cropland, rangeland if you're probably in the Midwest, grassland, located in an area that is historically dominated by grassland, forbs, or shrubs, and could provide habitat for animal or plant populations of significant ecological value, pasture land, and non-industrial private forest land that contributes to the economic viability of an offered parcel or serves as a buffer to protect such land from development. So it could be, for example, an active sugar lot, used for maple syrup. So the next slide. So this talks a little bit about eligible land where you have prime, unique, or other productive soil. So to meet the soil's eligibility criteria, the offered parcel must contain at least 50% prime, unique, statewide, or locally important soil. The 50% may be comprised of one type or a combination of such soils. Prime, unique, statewide, or locally important soil designations are located on the NRCS Web Soil Survey, and they're defined as prime farmland is land that has the best combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing food, fiber, feed, and forage. Unique farmland is land other than prime farmland that's used for the production of specific high-value food and fiber crops as determined by NRCS. It has a special combination of soil quality, location, growing season, moisture supply needed to economically produce sustained high quality and high yields of specific crops. in accordance with acceptable farming methods. Examples of such crops could include citrus, tree nuts, olives, cranberries, fruits, and vegetables. And then land of state or local importance. It's land other than prime or unique farmland that is of statewide or local importance, production for food fiber, feed, forage, biofuels, or oilseed crops. So the appropriate state or local government determines statewide or locally important farmland with concurrence from the state conservationist. Generally, these farmlands produce high yields. So that's something that I mentioned is being looked at a lot more, and it has been something that's been of interest in the state for at least the last couple, if not 3 years, more than perhaps before. On the next slide, it talks about land eligibility and talking about historical or archaeological resources. So what that means is it could be sites, land that's listed in the National Register of Historic Places, formally determined eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. So maybe it hasn't actually been listed yet. Formally listed in a state or tribal registry of historic places, included in the State Historic Preservation Office or Tribal Historic Preservation Office's inventory. So for parcels determined eligible.
Rita, sorry to jump in. We're just going to do a quick time check with you. Just want to make sure we get through all the slides too here. Sorry to rush you.
No, I can go faster.
Yes, that'd be great.
I'm gonna need to go faster.
Yep.
So I'll
Yeah,
just
maybe
hit.
skip ahead to the next section.
Topic. Okay.
Thank you, Rita. Appreciate it.
Sure. Okay. So again, historical archaeological resources. Next slide, protection of grazing uses and related conservation values. Okay, so we talked about that earlier, shrublands, forbs as such. Land that furthers a state or local policy. So that's something that we've been talking about. It's in policy. We have language that we can utilize to try to move that along. As we mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of information that we're not going to be able to get in too deep on today, but just to be aware that some of these things are there. And then land eligibility. To be eligible, land must be cropland, rangeland, not found in Massachusetts, grassland, located in an area that's historically dominated by grassland, forbs, shrubs, pasture land, or non-industrial private forest land that contributes to the economic viability of an offered parcel. Next slide. Eligible land that's considered incidental land. So incidental land includes such land as like farmstead areas, other areas with agricultural buildings or infrastructure, forest land, non-forested wetlands, which may be included if they're necessary for the efficient administration of an easement, significantly augments the protection of easement lands. Next slide, additional land eligibility requirements. Eligible land must be subject to a written pending offer by an eligible entity. And for the purposes of ACEP ALE, tribal lands are eligible under certain conditions. Tribes may apply for ACEP ALE as an eligible entity, or they can also apply as a landowner. Ineligible lands. So the following lands are not eligible for ACEP ALE. Lands owned by an agency of the United States, lands owned in fee title by a state or local government, lands subject to an easement or deed restrictions similar to ACEP ALE. So if you've already got an easement on that for perpetuality, it's not eligible. Land owned by non-governmental organization whose purpose is to protect agriculture use and related conservation value unless the land is owned on a transition basis as part of a buy, sell, protect transaction. Land where the purpose of the program would be undermined due to on-site or off-site conditions, such as a risk of hazardous materials, permitted or existing rights of ways, infrastructure development, or adjacent land uses. Land that NRCS determines to have unacceptable exceptions to clear title or insufficient legal access. Land on which gas, oil, earth, or mineral rights exploration has been leased or is owned by someone other than the landowner, unless NRCS determines that the third-party rights will not harm or interfere with achieving the ACEP ALE purposes. Okay, so next slide is landowner eligibility. So to be eligible, all landowners need to be listed on the property deed or equivalent. Current evidence of ownership documentation must be established in the Service Center Information Management System. So what that basically says is anyone that's interested that has any attachment to that property, if their name is on the deed, they will need to establish farm records and do eligibility paperwork with our sister agency, the Farm Services Agency. So they would have to complete all of the forms for that. And we have information on our website what is required for that.
Rita, I'm jumping in again. Rita, just want to let you know we have to let Alan go on in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks.
Okay. Yep. I'll skip and move on to ALE agreement types. Just to let everybody know, the slides are available. This is being recorded, so you're all welcome to have the set of slides. And then if you have questions, by all means, just ask us. You can email us, whichever's the easiest. Agreements, there's cooperative agreements, grant agreements, program agreements, definitions of each. I don't want to take up too much time. Cooperative agreements, entities may submit a request for a cooperative agreement. Grant agreements may only be used by certified eligible entities. Agreement processes. NRCS cannot execute agreements until we go through a process with our internal controls. And so internal controls has to review all the documentation that we submit for an application. So there's a process. It takes a little bit of time, but eventually, you know, when everything lines up, everything seems to get through fine. Program agreements. Program agreements are for ACEP ALE. States must have written authorization from the Deputy Chief for Programs prior to use of this kind of an agreement for a program agreement. So program agreements, that's what we've been working on now. They are one-time agreements, good for 3 to 5 years. You don't have to amend them. If you do, if there's any amendment needed, that can be done at any time through that 3 to 5 year process. And an eligible entity would have a program agreement, and then they could, over that time span, keep getting new applications from eligible landowners on eligible land, and could continue to move forward through the years with new applications. I have an example here, and it's on 29 of program agreements and contract relationships. Just kind of gives a very general overview of a bit of a time frame in, you know, how long it might take from the time that an application was accepted. So if someone were to submit an application November 19th, which is our first cutoff date, we could in theory have an agreement with that eligible entity executed by January of 2022, and it would expire of 9/30 of 2024. And in that time frame, we could in theory have, you know, 4 or 5, 10, you know, applications come through and actually be funded. There's minimum deed terms that are required as part of ALE agreements. There's ALE closings and stewardship. Talks about, I just have a bunch of little, highlights of what those requirements are. Responsibilities are ensure clear title, obtain title insurance, acquire easements, and complete baseline documentation. That's all responsibility of the eligible entity. Stewardship, after the easement is closed, the entity is responsible for the stewardship of the easement, provides yearly monitoring reports, and addresses any potential violations. NRCS does not monitor ACEP ALE. NRCS has contingent third-party right of enforcement, which is all part of the minimum deed terms. Cutoff dates for Massachusetts ALE applications. Our first round cutoff is November 19th, Friday. We'll accept applications for our first round up till November 19th. We'll have another batching round on January 21st, and our last one will be March 18th, just because it takes so long to get through the process. Massachusetts NRCS website, there's an easements page. There's, I'll make sure that that's available when this information goes out. It's also on this slide. And I've also included on our easement page a link to American Farmland Trust Information Center. This is just a very quick 25 years of conservation easements. As Nate mentioned, Massachusetts has the oldest easement program in the country. And this just gives you an idea of how many acres and how many easements are out there. I'll skip the questions. The only other thing I wanted to mention is, if people do have questions, and there are a lot more in-depth questions, two folks that are on my staff that are on the easement staff are Helen Castles and John Cote. So if there are additional questions that folks are interested or need help with, by all means, feel free to reach out. Thank you, Jamie. I'm done.
Thanks, Rita. Appreciate it. Sorry to rush you along. I know there's so much information here, and I know we all have tons of questions, but this is just a quick overview. So next up, I'd like to invite Alan Decker from Buzzards Bay to kind of share your experience with some of the ALE programs. Thanks for being here, Alan.
Sure. Thanks very much, Jamie. Thanks, Rita. And I'm Alan Decker, Buzzards Bay Coalition. For those of you that don't particularly know about the organization, we work in Southeastern Mass, principally and primarily in the watershed for Buzzards Bay, which is Southeastern Mass, covers 20 some odd towns, Southeastern Mass. And we have done 3 of these farmland protection programs with the NRCS folks. We did our first exposure to them was back in 2014 under the previously known FRPP program that Rita mentioned. And then we have done a project as recently as 2017 and 2020. 2 different towns in our watershed. The first one we did was in Fairhaven, and it was a property that had been of interest to us for quite some time. It was farmland, and we needed to figure out how we were going to pay for the protection of it. It was waterfront, or had waterfront sections to it, so price was high. We decided to jump into the at the time the FRPP program, now known as ALE, as Rita mentioned, and it was a bit of a trial by fire, if you will. We didn't really know how the program worked, but actually Rita's predecessors in the program really guided us and helped us tremendously in getting that done. And we've had 2 additional good experiences with the program. So just wanted to give a 30,000 foot overview of how the program works. And I would say that if you're thinking of the program, your first move is to actually figure out if you've got soils on the prospective property that are going to be supported by this program. And Rita mentioned this 50% either prime or soils of statewide concern. So my first call was to the NRCS mapping component here in Southeastern Mass. That means being in touch with the folks in the West Wareham Service Center and get mapping done by NRCS. And that very quickly lays out if you've got the percentages that are going to work for the project. At that point, we got in touch with the program over in Amherst, and we started working on the eligibility elements. First of all, as Rita mentioned, we had to be qualified to be involved in the program. So that's the entity eligibility that was mentioned. We are a combination of a land trust organization and a advocacy program. So I work in the land protection arena. Should let you know that there are 2 of us that work on projects, and I have 2 co-workers that also handle our stewardship responsibilities. That is part of making sure that you're eligible, as Rita mentioned. You've got to be able to follow through on your commitments to perpetuity, as it were. So you work through the eligibility, and then the other element is getting your landowner qualified under the program. As Rita mentioned, that's working with farm services. Again, here in our area, that means working with the good folks in Taunton. There is some paperwork that does need to get filed. The landowner does need to be in the system. I don't remember the acronym that Rita used, but fortunately, we were working with we've worked with existing farmers on all 3 of our projects. So they were known to Farm Services Agency. So it wasn't a matter of getting the property enrolled in Farm Services or known to the U.S. Department of Agriculture as it was. But that can be a little tedious, honestly. There's documentation that does need to be supported by information from the landowner. But you get through all of that, and then actually what you're talking about is in these agricultural land easements here in Massachusetts, you're really talking about a conservation restriction that emphasizes the agricultural use of the property. That was what was attractive to our landowners versus working with the state DAR program for whatever reason. So part of the process also is establishing the value so that the amount of ALE funding that gets made available to you, it can be figured out. We are talking about a federal agency here, so we are talking about an appraisal to federal standards. The USFLA acronym, also known as Yellow Book. The appraisal can be a process, can be somewhat expensive because of the standards that are required. That appraisal, once it's done, though, also gets reviewed by the NRCS ALE program. They have a suite of national reviewers who will review the appraisal and work with the private appraiser that you've hired to get any adjustments that are necessary so that the adjustments to the technical aspects of the appraisal so that it can be qualified as an acceptable appraisal to the program. That is just part of working with the program. From there, you have an option. I saw a question in the chat box about a template document. There is one. We at the coalition, we prefer to use our template, which is based on the state Massachusetts template. We incorporate our elements into that document, our agricultural reserved rights that we like to see with landowners. There was a mention of minimum deed terms. These are required by the ALE program. those can be incorporated into your easement document, or the path that we choose to follow is we amend our easement, our restriction document, with these minimum deed terms as an exhibit. There is language in the minimum deed terms that if there's construction difference between the easement document and the minimum deed terms, then the minimum deed terms actually are superior to wording in the easement. We haven't found that that's a problem. In fact, there have been a time or two in some interpretations, we've been a little more restrictive in the easement document than the minimum deed terms, and that's allowed. That's just, it's possible to do it that way. So, but the minimum deed terms get as I said, get amended to our document. Jamie, keep me on time, okay? I don't want to run over. I've seen what you do to people. So, in any case, just
Very cool.
Okay.
I have a self-serving question, Alan. Could you follow up on that? Did you have any challenge with modifying your land trust CR with getting that approved by folks at EEA? You know, I think some land trusts might be wondering how you kind of mash up what the federal folks would like you to do and what the state here in Massachusetts would like you to do.
Sure. So good question. Appreciate that, Jamie. So we came as in the natural process, we came to agreement with our landowner on what this was going to look like. Before I presented it to EEA, I had it went through the review, the national review. There is legal counsel that we worked with from NRCS. I believe the attorney in my instance was based in Florida, but does these things around the country. Got to a point where he was satisfied with things. And then I presented it to EEA. I said, this is an alternative to the APR. I know that EEA doesn't look at the APR documents, but I just said, this is a private conservation restriction that's using federal ag money, and happy to work through it with you. To be candid, this was the first time we went through this. This was before John Joya was at EEA, and didn't have any issues. And in the two more recent ones where John was in place as the EEA CR reviewer, it hasn't been an issue, Jamie, candidly, because we anticipated the merging of the minimum deed terms with our restriction. And so we tried to mirror them as much as we could. I don't recall landowners having particular issues with the minimum deed terms. The one that stands out in my head in the minimum deed terms is there's a percentage of the conserved land that there's a limitation as to how much of that can be impervious for our purposes. And I believe it was 2%. So what that means is that up to 2% of the acreage you're protecting through the ALE program could be impervious. The amounts of acreage that we were working with, 2% was way more than we were comfortable with, and way more than the landowner ever in their wildest dreams thought that they would need. So that didn't prove to be a problem. And that was an example of where we were actually a little more restrictive than the minimum deed terms. Also, should just say, here in Southeastern Mass, agricultural land sizes vary greatly. Our first project in 2014, we actually protected 187 acres. Now that's a tremendous amount in our neck of Massachusetts, perhaps not so much west of the Connecticut River, but we did it across 3 separate properties under the same ownership. Then our middle project, our second project in 2017 was 55 acres. And then our most recent one, we actually did a 10-acre farm in the town of Dartmouth, of which only 3 acres was actually actively under production. the farmer has ideas of expanding, but it was amazing the production she was getting from 3 acres, and the ALE program loved that project, had great soils. I think that's the key, really. If you've got your good soils and your percentages are right, ALE is going to be right there to help you figure out how to make the project work. Really, though, that's the 30,000 overview. I want to say, once you get the project done and get the restriction recorded, as Rita mentioned, we are obligated to document regular stewardship. So we include it as part of our monitoring program. And when we do our ALE projects, we produce a report that does get filed with NRCS on an annual basis. That's what they want to see. That's what Department of Agriculture wants to see, and that's our requirement. And so far, the duty that we haven't had an issue with any sort of compliance. And I would say the last thing I'll really say on this is the projects take time. You need patience in getting everything squared away. It can seem a bit formidable in working through all of the elements of the program, but Rita and Dan and Helen and all of those folks in the NRCS program are really great to work with. Sometimes their hands are a little bit tied by Washington bureaucracy or Washington timing, but they do an absolute bang up job on getting funding out as soon as it's available and when you need it. But you need to counsel your landowners that yes, the project's going to get done, but it may not get done in the absolute time frame you have your project under contract, and we've had to get an extension or two just to make sure that everything gets done. So with that, Jamie, I'm happy to go on, but I could also stop.
No, this is so great. I'm going to try to squeeze in a few questions for both you and Rita really quick. I know we have to wrap up at 11, and we definitely should have planned this as like a 2-hour call. And so I know you all may have many questions for both of our speakers, but maybe I could just start off with you, Alan. I think folks may be wondering in terms of match with the 50% match, if you could speak really briefly to some of the potential sources for identifying that match.
Sure, be happy to. Yeah, match is important because the ALE program can only match up to 50% of the value of the easement. So match can come from a number of sources. We did a lot of private fundraising to make match. We also, though I saw in the chat box, on one of our projects, we associated the local town conservation commission as a co-holder on the easement. That enabled us to then pursue Community Preservation Act funding in that particular town. So we got some funding for the project through CPA because of the CONCOM. We also, the same project, we approached EEA under the Conservation Partnership Grant Fund because we're buying a CR. And so we were able to do that as well. And documenting, there is the capacity to document bargain sale elements of the project for a portion of the match. Not all of it, I don't believe, but some element, some portion of match can be documented by getting the landowner to agree to pay for a less than fair market value price.
That's great. And just while I have you talking, Alan, another question in the chat is about the WRE, Wetland Reserve Easement, and if your organization has ever used that part of the program.
Yes, we have. I was going to mention it, but then Rita just kept saying ALE, ALE, ALE. But since you asked, we have done, we've done one Wetland Reserve Easement program and project, and we are currently working on a second one. Worked really well. This was, in our case, both of these are retiring cranberry bogs in our region. And what ended up happening was USDA purchased the easement directly from the landowner at the value that the program was willing to pay. And then we stepped in after the big money was spent with the retirement of the bogs and purchasing of the easement. and we bought the restricted fee for much, much less. So we actually now own these properties and are doing ecological restoration on them, and they're open to the public. But the WRE program works well as well. It's the same process. You have to get the appraisal done and all that sort of thing. But in that instance, it's USDA buying the easement directly from the private landowner. So but it works very similarly.
Would that be applicable for folks looking at farmland protection as well, using that tool?
Well, so WRE is wetland restoration easement. You're and Rita may be able to speak to this certainly more directly than I. Our projects worked well because these were flow through cranberry bogs that had water flowing through them. They were wetlands. They had become cranberry bogs, and we wanted to turn them back into wetlands again. So that's what we're doing. I think you have to have a fair component of the project to be wetland in order to be eligible for that project, not upland farmland.
Great.
Am I right, Rita? Am I right?
Yes, you are correct. That's the intent. And the intent is to take the land out of production, which is opposite of what ALE does. ALE requires that you keep farming the land, or someone keeps farming the land. With WRE, the land comes out of production, it is restored back to its natural habitat. And as Alan mentioned, between, whether it be BBC purchasing those properties or towns, we've seen a lot of towns purchase those properties after the WRE easement is on that land, and then it's open to public access. So it provides public access for folks. A lot of people like to go birding, especially down in the Cranberry area of the state. That's where we have the majority of our WREs.
Great. Gosh, I wish we had another hour because I'm sure folks just have boatloads of questions. What we will be doing is, gathering all the questions in the chat. We'll make sure they got answered. We'll pull together contact info for you, Rita, Alan, if you're willing to receive questions from folks. Are you? Thumbs up.
I am.
You're too kind. You're too kind. So thank you. Yes. So what we're going to do, folks, I know this was a deep dive for everyone here on the call. I know you may have a lot more questions and answers, but what we're going to do is try to pull together all the resources from NRCS, also from AFT's website, as well as on our Farmland Information Center. Emmelin's going to paste that in the chat as well. The Farmland Information Center, as well as just to plug again our new agricultural land network, which we encourage all of you to join. It's just a really awesome resource. It's got land trusts and land professionals on it from around the country. You can join different groups in there. You can ask all kinds of questions, and it's just a really great peer-to-peer resource. We haven't done as much of a push in New England yet, but we will be, and we really hope you will join that as well. So we are going to wrap up, and I just want to really, really thank our presenters today for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. Thank you all for joining. We will be sending around this recording and resources to all of you, and we encourage you to follow up with any questions at all. So thank you all so much, and we're here for further questions you may have.
Thank you
very much.
Nice. Thanks all.
Right.